Hi, Cole here. I am thrilled that you've tuned in today because this year marks the 10th anniversary of the publication of my first book, Storytelling with Data. To mark the occasion, we are releasing a super special updated hardcover edition that publishes today. And to celebrate, I thought it would be fun to share 10 lessons that have stood the test of time over the past decade of teaching people to communicate effectively with data. We're going to start out simple and get increasingly nuanced as we go along. For those who are tuning in live, make sure you have your chat window accessible. That's how you'll be interacting over the course of our time together today. It's also where you'll ask questions, which we'll turn to a little bit later in the session. With that, let's jump in. With our first lesson, to use mostly bars and lines. There are many types of graphs out there. The good news is there are a common few that will meet the majority of your needs. When I wrote Storytelling with Data 10 years ago, I looked at all the visuals I made over the course of a year, hundreds of them, and categorized them. These are the 12 that I used most. When I look at this through today's lens, we can simplify even further to bars and lines, plus some variations on these. These are the 6 we reach for most at Storytelling with Data when working with our clients. There are a couple perhaps notable absences from this picture, and we'll look at a couple of those over the course of our time together today. One of those is a data table. Let's explore why we don't tend to use tables to communicate data through an example. Here is a simple table. It's titled Daily Makeup Use and shows the percent reporting daily use. We see types of makeup across the top, mascara, lipstick, and so forth, and 2 rows of data, one for 2019 and another for 2025. Notice this is a super simple table, and yet it takes quite a lot of cognitive processing. If you're like me, I'm scanning across rows, reading the numbers, trying to remember them so that I can compare them to other numbers. A highly taxing cognitive process. Anything we can do to make this data visual is going to make it faster for people to see. Let's take a look at how we might do that. Let me start off with a line graph. Here we've got a gray line for 2019 and a maroon one for 2025. Notice how suddenly with this change, we can see the shape of the data, start to see comparisons immediately that we had to put thought into to get at before. That said, I don't love lines here. When we use a line graph, we want the actual lines to be meaningful. Here, they're connecting categories. When it's categorical data we've got, a bar chart is your very best friend. I love bars because they're common. It means less of a learning curve for our audience to get at the information. We don't have to spend time explaining the graph. They already know how to read it. Now, with a standard vertical pairwise bar chart like this, what our eyes are really doing are comparing the endpoints of the bars. We're just going to put some lines and markers there. Once we do that, we actually no longer need the bars. I can take those away. Once we take away the bars, we also don't need the spatial separation. So I can collapse this, put some details around it, and now we have what's known as a slope graph. Whereas the bars really caused us to focus on absolute values, with a slope graph, the emphasis is on the change, the lines that connect the points. And notice here now the lines are meaningful. They represent the change from 2019 to 2025. Also, something interesting stands out to me with this view of the data that I didn't notice in the others, and that is how much more mascara and lipstick are used compared to the other makeup products. And that highlights one benefit of iterating through different views as we're doing here. When we see things in a different way, we actually see different things, get to know our data better, and maybe get to understand what might work best for communicating it to others as well. Let's keep iterating. Next, I'm going to try things out in a horizontal bar chart. These are one of my favorite types of graphs. It's easy to read. I also like how it orients the titling at the upper left so that I hit how to read the data before I get to the data. Here I've superimposed 2025 on top of 2019 so that it shows the latest date in the forefront, the historical date behind, but left enough of the latter visible so that we can easily compare. In the same way that we iterated on that vertical bar chart, let's see what we might do with this horizontal variety. Put some markers at the end, take away the bars, collapse the markers onto a single line, connect them, add some details, and now we have a dot plot, which is just another way to show this sort of data. Now, I'm curious. We've looked at things in a number of different ways. If you were the one communicating this information, which view would you use? Let's put some letters up here to make that easy for those who are providing their responses in chat. Let me know which one you like best. Do you favor A, the vertical bars, B, the slope graph, C, horizontal bars, or D, the dot plot? This is one of my favorite points now, to just watch chat and see all of the responses rolling in. And I see A, C, D, B, A or C, D, C, B. All of these are favored by someone. Depends on audience and purpose. Yeah, so fun to watch the chat window there. There is no single right answer when it comes to this. I hope what we've just looked at convinces you that any data can be visualized a number of different ways. And as I've seen a number of people point out, which we choose depends probably first and foremost on one thing, and that is our audience and what's going to work for them. Hold on to that idea. We will come back to it. In the meantime, I will share that my favorite view here, and I already alluded to this before, but it's the horizontal bars. But we aren't done with this example yet. We'll come back to it soon. In the meantime, though, we can consider our first lesson learned. Use mostly bars and lines. Next, let's wield our words wisely. When you are the one who made a graph, it is patently obvious to you what the data represents. However, to make that clear to others, we need to use words. We need to title and label. Let's take a look at how we can do this through an example. Here, we could be looking at anything. I made this graph, so I know what this data is, but do you? No, you have no idea. Check out what happens, though, as I start to add details. Once we see that our company is the blue line, now we already have enough information to start making some assumptions. Maybe I'm supposed to compare it to the dotted line there, or maybe the dotted line is a trend line. This is the sort of brain power that we don't want our audience to have to use, because when we label things directly, there's no question about what we're looking at. Now that I see the dotted line represents the industry benchmark, I can say, all right, we're supposed to compare these two things. I don't yet know, however, whether being above the benchmark is a good thing or a bad thing. If these are errors or issues of some sort, that's not going to be good that we're trending above average. Turns out, however, this is annual inventory turnover, where the y-axis represents the number of inventory turns, which means being better than the industry is a good thing. Now, taking things a step further, we can use our words to tell our audience what we want them to see or know from our graph. For example, if I add a takeaway title at the top that says success, inventory turnover surpasses the industry for the first time in 4 years, now I know what to look for when I get to the data. Beyond that, studies have shown that when we title in this manner, so when we tell our audience what we want them to see or the takeaway, they are more likely going to remember that takeaway. That is powerful. I often use slide titles for this, and you'll see me use slide titles in that manner throughout our session today. Let's take a look back at the horizontal bar chart we saw previously. We already did a good job with our titling there, but we can use our words even more wisely than this. Put a takeaway title at the top. Add some annotations at the side, a clear recommendation. With that, let's recap our second lesson. We've learned to wield words wisely. Next, grid lines are gratuitous. And not only grid lines, really anything that gets in the way of our data and our message. If you picture a blank page or a blank screen, every single item we add contributes to cognitive burden. And that means we want to take a look at what doesn't need to be there. In other words, we want to declutter. So when we do that, we'll find that our data stands out more. Let's take a look at an example. I'm curious, when you are faced with this graph, what clutter would you eliminate? Now, just to take a step back at what we're looking at here, we see ticket volume received and processed, a gray bar for ticket volume received, a blue bar for ticket volume processed. All right, I see grid lines is the first suggestion. Yeah, I led with that, so that's an obvious one, but yes, we should get rid of the grid lines here. Data values is something else that has come up. So right now we have every single value labeled. That is looking messy and probably overkill. This is a common decision point that we need to make. Do we label our data directly or have an axis or maybe some combination of those? What you want to think about there is the level of specificity that your audience needs to have with the values. If the specific numeric values are important, you might want to label those directly. If you'd rather your audience focuses on the shape of the data, the comparisons, then we don't want to clutter the graph with that and can instead preserve the axis. The border around the entire thing. Yes, the border, we can get rid of decimals. We have trailing zeros on our y-axis labels. One of my pet peeves. They carry absolutely no information and yet make the data look more complicated than it needs to. Let's get rid of those. I see a comment about abbreviating the months to get rid of that diagonal text. Yes, let's do that. Diagonal text looks messy and is slower to read than its horizontal counterpart. I'm scanning through the comments here. See anything else? Yeah, I had to scroll back to see if I could find it. I thought that I probably would be able to, which is, if we've been looking at the data this long and you're wondering, why isn't this a line graph? I think that's something we should explore. And again, the more unnecessary elements that we are able to eliminate, the easier it is to really bring the attention to our data. It gives us the ability to create contrast in some interesting ways that we're going to look at soon. Before we do that, though, let's see the power of decluttering. Actually get rid of all of these suggestions you've made. So I'll start, just as we started going through the comments, by getting rid of the grid lines. Next, I'll remove the border from the outside of the graph. It's always amazing to me how much those two steps alone do in terms of making my data stand out more. Next, I'll remove all those data labels. That certainly lightens things up. I'll drop the trailing zeros from my y-axis, abbreviate the months horizontally on the x-axis, and watch this next step because it's simple, but it's a big one, which is when I change from bars to lines. While I do that, I also want to get rid of the back and forth between the legend and the data. I can do that by simply labeling the data directly. Now, while I put those data labels next to the data they describe, I'm also going to make them the same color as the data they describe. It's just another cue to my audience that says these things are related. Now, back to lesson 2 on wielding our words wisely. I'm going to title so that we know what we're looking at. Check out the impact we just made on this graph. Each of these steps on its own, totally minor. But when you put them together, they have amazing impact. Our third lesson, we've just covered it. Grid lines are gratuitous, and so are a lot of other things. Next, contrast is key. Now, similar to as we saw when we looked at the graph without any titles or labels, the person who put it together knew what they were looking at, but nobody else did. We had to make thoughtful word choices to make that clear. Now, the same is true when it comes to where we want people to look. When you make a graph or a slide, it's clear to you where you want people to pay attention. But for that to be clear to others, we need to take thoughtful steps in how we design. Let's take a look at an example. I'm curious how you might focus attention in this graph. Let's assume we want people to focus on the latest data, the line representing 2025. And just to back up, here we're looking at customer complaints over time. We have a number of complaints on the y-axis, dates along the x-axis, months ranging from January to December. And then I have a line for each year starting at 2021 and moving forward through time. All right, if you have ideas for how to draw attention to 2025, stick those in the chat window. I see some of those starting to roll in. Leverage contrast, highlight 25. Yes, gray out the others and highlight 2025. Vote for changing the scale. We have line graphs, so we actually could do that here and zoom in. Gets us a little more space. Current year color only. Yeah, so if we use our color thoughtfully and sparing. I see a lot of votes for making the other data gray, and I love that. Make the 2025 line thicker. Yes, this is another means of contrast that we have at our disposal. We can make the line thicker, the other lines thinner, or a combination of those. We can also bold the text 2025. I see someone suggesting use the year in the title. This is a great one. We can actually prime our audience with words. I see a suggestion for a dotted line. Yes, changing the line style is going to be attention grabbing. We'll take a look at that in a moment. Actually, let's take a look at a few different options we might have for creating contrast here. And now, as many people have suggested, starting by making everything gray is a really good idea. And this is something that we will commonly do when trying to figure out both where and how we might direct people's attention within a graph. We can certainly do so by making use of color. So here now 2025 is the one line that is a different color from the rest. As was suggested, we can also make it thicker, bold 2025, make the other lines thinner. I can make use of a different line style. So here the dotted line of 2025 garners attention. One thing to notice though is it does also introduce some visual clutter because I've taken one line and chopped it into a bunch of pieces. And because of that, I recommend preserving your use of dotted lines for when you have uncertainty to depict. Might be a target or a forecast of some sort because that embedded feeling of uncertainty with dotted lines makes up for the bit of clutter that they introduce. Could take away all of the other data, which certainly makes 2025 stand out more, though we lose some context in doing so. So a twist on this that I like is we could show all of the other data and then have 2025 appear. And that simple fact of it being absent and then appearing attracts your attention. We can add data markers, data labels. If we do it everywhere, we end up with a cluttered mess. But if I'm sparing about which I include, I can actually enforce you to make certain visual comparisons. So for example, if I only label January and December, it's natural for you to compare those 2 points of data. Or if I wanted to draw attention to the increase we've seen in recent months, I might put data markers and labels just there. Speaking of that, I love the idea of priming with words. If I say something about the increase in 2025, now that's what you'll be looking for when you get to the graph. We don't have to do just one of these things. We can employ several ways to make it clear where we want our audience to look. Use words to prime, make the line thicker, use color, label sparing data points. Take a look back at the example we saw previously and just note how contrast was employed to direct attention here. With that, we have now covered our fourth lesson. Contrast is key. Next, we're going to animate or annotate. When we share data, it is typically one of two ways. Either we are live with our audience, either virtually or in person on a stage or in a meeting, sitting around a table, or we're sending something off to be consumed on its own. Now, ideally, these two different scenarios call for totally different communications. Sparse slides for when I'm there so that they're not competing for my attention and I, as the speaker, can lend context and detail. And a much more detailed version that's going to be sent around so that the audience has everything they need in order to interpret. Now, while that's ideal, it doesn't happen a lot. Instead, what we often get is this slidegement. Part slide, part document, not exactly meeting the needs of either of those scenarios. In that case, things are often too dense for the big screen and maybe not detailed enough for the version that gets sent around. This is where we can think of doing as I've suggested and animating or in some cases, and annotating. Let's take a look at an example. Ticket volume over time is what we're going to be looking at today. We have a number of tickets on the y-axis and months on our x-axis, ranging from January at the left to December at the right. Now, as we see, tickets received has varied from month to month, averages 170 a month over the course of the year. But there is quite a difference between the high and low points. We had a maximum of 241 tickets received in March and a low of 132 in July. Now, when it comes to tickets that have been processed, the team did a great job of making sure all were processed and service level agreements were met in the first part of the year, even keeping up with that peak we saw in March. However, in May, 2 employees left. We decided at the time not to backfill, thinking that we could make it work with the smaller team. We did nearly keep up the first couple months that followed. The team was working hard to try to meet demands, but this wasn't sustainable. And the increase in August was simply too much for the current team to handle. That, plus the team starting to feel a bit burnt out, caused the gap between incoming tickets and those processed to grow. And it's become clear that we simply can't keep up with the incoming volume. And in fact, the gap between incoming tickets and those that have been processed and resolved is more than 200 tickets. This isn't only impacting our team, but all of those that we support. Given that we're continuing to operate on a first in, first out basis, we're meeting our 24-hour service level agreement only 14% of the time. So I'm seeking your approval to hire 2 full-time employees to backfill those who left. We can get the team working hard to get through the backlog if they know this is coming. And I'm confident we can get back to service levels that delight. I might animate something like that. And then for the version that gets sent around, I would annotate everything there so that the person who is processing it on their own would get the same sort of story that I would take my audience through in a live setting. This is a simple example, but you can imagine how this approach could work for something more complicated as well. That's our 5th lesson: animate or annotate. And I'll just mention these first 5 ideas are straightforward. You can apply them to make better graphs. But the next 5 I'm going to share are the critical ones. If you can internalize and apply these, you will be a more effective communicator. Before we get to those, I want to mention quickly that the examples I'm sharing today are from our 2 newest books. Before and After came out in September. This was written together with my colleagues Mike Cisneros and Alex Velez. It features 20 client-inspired case studies where we start with the less than ideal client graph, slide, or presentation and really take you through the iteration process, sharing tips and lessons along the way and culminating in a powerful data story. And then, of course, we have the super special 10th anniversary edition hardcover of Storytelling with Data. Maybe I'll take just a moment to tell you about what's different here. One is just the beautiful cover. And actually, this fancy belly band in the front comes off. There is also a new foreword where I reflect on the past 10 years. All of the graphs have been refreshed, meaning anything that had dates in it going through 2014, 2015 now is up to current 2024, 2025. I did completely swap out just a couple examples that felt dated to ones that are more of the times, but for the most part, the examples remained unchanged. I did add 3 appendices of new content and ideas and ways of thinking that have come up over the past 10 years. And there are some fun design details too that I hope you will enjoy. You can find info on these titles and the rest of the Storytelling with Data library at storytellingwithdata.com/books. I'll also mention that one way to get comfortable with the lessons that we're covering today is to go more in depth, see how they play out across varied examples, and of course, to practice. In our team trainings and workshops, you get all of that. Learning from our amazing crew of data storytellers, working on your own and with others, sharing ideas and getting feedback. We offer team trainings for groups that range from 2 hours to a full day or more, where we customize using your examples to illustrate key lessons. We also have sessions for individuals, including 4-hour virtual workshops that are offered quarterly and a hands-on 8-week online course, with our next cohort beginning in January 2026. I believe that there is some early bird pricing that is still in effect this month. You can learn more about all of this by visiting the URLs you see here. Back to today's lessons. Let's communicate for them. This is a common mistake I see people make. Communicating for yourself, your data, your project, when really everything we're doing should be for the people on the receiving end. If we can take their needs into account, we will make better graphs and slides and do just a better job of communicating. We want to identify our audience, narrow, take their needs into account. And taking things a step further, if you have different important audiences who have sufficiently different needs, you may actually need to communicate to them separately. With that in mind, let's take a look at an example. Let's assume I've been asked to give an update on call center activity. It would be easy to follow up with a graph like this, where my y-axis is the number of customer service calls, the x-axis is call initiation time over the course of a day. It's a single data set, but depending on the audience, what we do with it could actually look quite different. And this is where we really have an opportunity, where we could move from a service provider, where we just have people coming at us and asking for data, to a strategic partner, where they're coming at us with business problems that we can use data to help them solve. Let's imagine 3 disparate audiences for this data. First off, staffing managers. For them, it might be all about shift timing. Human resources, HR, might care about employee scheduling policies. Systems operations would be concerned with things like diagnosing and preventing system outages. For each of these, let's imagine I'm going to create something that will be sent around rather than presented live. That said, I'm going to build it one piece at a time here so it doesn't totally overwhelm you all at once. So with our first audience of staffing managers, I can start with the takeaway. Call volume is heaviest during lunch hour and in the mid-afternoon. Have a graph that illustrates this, can stick some annotations over on the side explaining what's going on and ending in a clear recommendation. We encourage managers to schedule lunch breaks or small team meetings during the time period between these 2 peaks. Notice how we've also applied all of the lessons we've covered so far, using a simple line graph, employing a primary takeaway title, titling and labeling a graph that is free of clutter, using contrast to direct your attention, and annotating the relevant details. For my HR audience, remember they're concerned about scheduling policies. My takeaway title could be something like, Fridays have the lowest daily call volume by a large margin. Show my graph that breaks things down by day of the week, highlighting Friday, calling that or combining that with the tagline up top through similar use of color. And again, annotation and a recommendation on the right. Comp time, team building, and paid time off might be best scheduled for Fridays. And then finally, our third audience, system operations. Again, they're interested in diagnosing and preventing system outages. Tagline up top, call tracking system suffered brief but major outage in week 6. A little bit of explanatory text that accompanies that, my graph that shows the issues with some numeric references that are explained on the side. With that, we'll consider our 6th lesson learned. We did all of that with our respective audience in mind. Number 7 suggests that we should start low tech. In other words, don't start in your tools. I can understand why there is a desire to do that. There is something that feels really productive about making graphs and slides. But when we're ready to communicate and we jump straight in and do that without a clear plan in place, it can lead to a lot of wasted effort. Where if we just take a few minutes up front in a low-tech fashion, using things like pen and paper and maybe even some Post-it notes, we can slow down in a way that's actually going to force us to think and be thoughtful, and that'll help us speed up in the rest of the process. What we want to take that time to do is get clear on who our audience is, craft our message succinctly, actually write things down on paper. Another thing we can do that is helpful at this stage is simply to talk out loud. And now it can be to someone else, and when you do that, there's often value in the exchange that ensues. But it's also useful even just to talk aloud to yourself. This helps you land on words and phrases that are going to work for what you want to explain, connect your ideas, and really get to know the facets of what's most important to communicate before you begin building content, whether a graph, slide, or presentation. Let me share an example. Imagine for a moment that I am a third grade science teacher. I love teaching science. But frustratingly, each year, kids come into my classroom and they have this negative preconception of science. They expect it's going to be difficult, it's going to be boring, they're not going to like it. We actually spend a good amount of time at the onset of each school year battling these negative preconceptions, which are sort of strange because kids haven't even had that much exposure to science at that point. So I was brainstorming with some colleagues, and we thought, what if we can get science in front of kids sooner? Can we positively impact their perceptions? We ran a summer learning program that was aimed at doing just that. And what we found, we think, is great early evidence of the success, which is coming into the program, most kids felt just okay about science, maybe hadn't made up their minds one way or another. Whereas after the program, nearly 70% of kids expressed interest and excitement towards science. We think this is a great program and we want to continue to offer it. When I can say my story that succinctly, it's so much easier to put together content that will help me get that story across. One of my favorite tools when it comes to that is sticky notes. Let's take a look at how we might storyboard, which is really just creating a visual outline of our content using sticky notes, and that example I just talked us through. You might start with the issue. Kids have a bad attitude about science. I might have some assignment grades over the course of the year that help demonstrate this. I could talk about the ideas we thought about for overcoming the issue, including the pilot program that we undertook. I can describe the pilot program, what our goals were, and so forth. I can use the survey data that I mentioned to show before and after, demonstrate success, and then I have my recommendation. Pilot was a success, let's expand it. Perhaps we need some budget to do that going forward. Once I can see all of the pieces, I can add, remove, rearrange. Here, for example, currently my call to action is at the end. I could play around and consider leading with that. This is also a great point at which to solicit directional feedback. Low fidelity is helpful here. Once you create something in your tool, a graph or a slide, it's easy for people to critique the design. When you're reviewing something rough like this, we focus more on the big picture. Is this an effective path to take? Are we focusing on the right pieces? Does our message come across clearly? This is a simple example, but I'll ask you to imagine how useful this practice is when you have something more nuanced you want to communicate. In that case, you get even more benefit to starting low tech and doing this sort of planning up front so that when you turn to your tools, you have a plan in place. Slow down. Take 20 minutes before turning to your tools to put pen to paper, say it out loud, and storyboard. In other words, start low tech. And after that, be bold. Recommend an action. What do you want your audience to do with the data you are sharing? If you're the one communicating, you likely know the situation and the data better than anyone else, which puts you in a unique position to help others derive greater value from that data. But you can't just show it to them and expect them to know what to do. You need to tell them. This is an instance where the typical path often misses this critical step. If we consider the typical path of a presentation or an analysis, we might start with the background, right? Why did we undertake this work in the first place? There's the problem statement. What did we set out to solve? The data, where did we get it? What did we do to clean it? What assumptions went into it? The analysis, right? What are the statistical methods we actually took to better understand the data? And then the findings. Now, oftentimes we stop there without ever getting to the critical step of providing a clear recommendation. And I think people shy away from doing this, maybe for fear that you lack context or that somebody else is better positioned to make the decision. And that might be totally true, but Not putting forth a recommendation makes it so easy for someone to say, oh, that's interesting, and turn their attention onto something else. Or worse, to ask you for more data. Whereas if you make a clear recommendation or suggestion, even if your audience disagrees, it starts a conversation. And it's a conversation focused on not how do we get more data, but how do we use the data? How do we take the new understanding that you've brought to light and do something with it? And it's not always as simple as we found X and therefore you should do Y. The actual action that you want people to take can take a ton of different forms. Right? This is a big list, and this is not even comprehensive. And I will say, though, if you can't figure out an action you are asking your audience to undertake, you should question whether you need to communicate to them in the first place. One way to get clear on what action might be appropriate is to ask yourself a simple question. What do I want my audience to think, feel, or do differently as a result of my communication? Let's take a look at an example. Let's imagine for a moment that you work on the marketing team at a car manufacturer, and you've just uncovered a new insight about customer behavior that's actually changing how you think about who you're targeting and how. There are a number of different actions we might prompt based on this general scenario. Maybe there's a strategic decision. If we've got a marketing campaign that's about to go live, might need somebody to stop that or change it. Or perhaps we need to influence others before securing approval or taking action. Maybe there's a team or cross-functional conversation that should happen to make sure everybody is aware of this new finding and that they're taking it into account in their own analyses. Perhaps there's follow-up research that should be undertaken to confirm findings or better understand the impact. Or maybe there's a metric or goal that should be updated in light of this new information. We'll revisit this example scenario momentarily, but in the meantime, I hope I've convinced you to be bold and recommend action. Next, let's tell a story. The simplest story consists of just 3 pieces: plot, twist, ending, where in a business setting, the plot is what is the context our audience needs to know in order to be in the right frame of mind to take in what we're going to tell them. Then the twist, what's interesting about the data or this new understanding that we have as a result of it. And then the ending, what do we want our audience to do? Let's take a look at an example and consider what story we could tell here. So this is the data from the summer learning program on science that we talked about a little bit earlier, where I can see how kids reported their feelings about science in the survey before on the left and after on the right, on a basis of bored, not great, okay, kind of interested, and excited. How's it feel comparing data across these 2 pies? You might recall these were not visuals that were on our recommended list earlier, and I'll sometimes joke that there is one thing worse than a pie. 2 pies, when you're trying to compare across them, because this is hard. But check out what happens if I walk you through the story. We have this issue where kids are coming into the classroom not excited about science. So we just piloted a summer learning program trying to change kids' perceptions. And we think what we found is great early evidence of success, which is going into the program, 40% of students, that big segment in green, felt just okay about science. Maybe hadn't made up their minds one way or the other. Whereas after the program, we see that big 40% shrink down to only 14%, that green segment on the right. Now, there was a little bit of movement that went in the bad direction. Bored and not great in blue and orange went up a percentage point each. But most of the movement was in the positive direction, wherein after the program, nearly 70% of kids, if we add together the teal and yellow segments, express some level of interest for science. this is a successful program. We should continue to offer it. Notice how, with a strong narrative, I can actually get away with a kind of crummy graph. The reverse is not true. I could have the most beautiful data visualization in the world, and if I can't talk through that in a way that gets your attention, brings you understanding, helps you understand how to act, that beautiful data visualization will fail. Now, magic happens when you have both of these things. You have a strong visual and a powerful narrative to go with it. Exposure to science excites kids. If you're my budget committee, that call to action at the top should be stronger. Please approve my budget. Summer learning program shows impact positively on science. We recommend continuing to offer it. We get to our data down below. Before the program, 40% felt just okay. After the program, we see this shift to the right. Kids are expressing interest and excitement about science. I'll just mention this is one of my favorite examples from storytelling with data. When I updated the 10th anniversary edition, I didn't touch this one. I did, however, add some additional content on story. Because while the lesson to tell a story certainly still holds true, we've evolved how we teach it over the years. And you'll find a new appendix in the 10th anniversary edition focused on the narrative arc. This is a framework that I am partial to. It's more robust than the simple story mountain of plot, twist, ending, and most business scenarios can map easily against it. For example, let's recall the car manufacturer scenario. I mentioned this example when we were talking about recommending action. Let's get a little more specific. You're on the marketing team at a car manufacturer that's getting ready to launch a new 5-passenger compact SUV, sports utility vehicle. You know car buyers tend to buy a similar type of car to what they already have, and your team has just used this to segment who to market to. But you learned that passenger capacity is another important factor, and this wasn't taken into account at all for the marketing segmentation. Let's see how this story could take shape. As you know, we are just about ready to launch the marketing campaign for our new compact 5-passenger sports utility vehicle. I recognize that it's late in the game, but in light of an important new finding, I recommend we refine our target audience. Just as a bit of background, we started by segmenting car owners. I'm going to be showing SUV sales by previous vehicle purchased. Our x-axis at the top there is number of vehicles sold. And then we have the different types of cars down the left-hand side. Let's add some data here. And now we started by segmenting and decided to go after those currently owning a compact SUV. Seems to make sense. It aligned roughly with our marketing budget and the number of people we wanted to target. The issue, though, is there's a factor that was not taken into account here. This is going to sound super obvious when I say it. 4 out of 5 car purchases, so the vast majority, are for the same passenger capacity as the owner currently drives. Again, I said this was probably going to sound obvious when I say it, but it actually wasn't considered in the initial segmentation. And that C SUV category has cars ranging from 5 to 8 passenger capacity, which means if we look at that bar that we were planning on targeting, more than half are unlikely to purchase because they currently drive SUVs with higher passenger capacity. Now, I don't think that means we should cut our marketing in half, however, because a segment of each of these car types is 5-passenger. So it's possible that targeting similar capacity cars could flip people into an SUV, particularly if we stick to similar types. That's actually what we recommend, is that we target 5-passengers vehicles of similar vehicle owners. What do you think? Do you agree? Can we move forward? What other teams do we need to get on board in order to meet our upcoming deadlines? Our 9th lesson is to tell a story, which brings me to number 10, act responsibly. These lessons may sound simple, but that simplicity can be deceptive. Choosing what data to show, how to visualize it, and how to speak about it, these are interpretive acts. And with that comes responsibility. The onus is on you to use data for good. And there really isn't a pithy example that I can use to illustrate this point. Rather, you must bring it to life, keeping it top of mind throughout your work and helping others to do so as well. Because even as the world, the tools, and the data evolve, one thing remains constant, and that is the need for clear and thoughtful communication. With that, you can consider your 10th lesson learned. And there you have it, the 10 most important lessons from the past 10 years. Use them in your work. When you have data to communicate, don't just make a graph. Consider how you can use these lessons to weave the data you want to communicate into a compelling story that prompts action. In just a moment, I will turn my attention to your questions. If you're watching live, please ask away in the chat window. For those watching later, please put your questions in the comments. I'll make sure we address those as well. Before I turn to questions, I mentioned our 2 newest books briefly before. Special hardcover 10th anniversary edition of Storytelling with Data and Before and After. Here you see them alongside the other books from the Storytelling with Data library. And I'll just mention that these make excellent gifts for the active or aspiring data storytellers in your life. Visit storytellingwithdata.com/books or your favorite bookseller to order. We also have more data story-themed fun for all ages in our shop. You can find that at storytellingwithdata.com/shop. And a quick reminder, if you're already looking ahead to the new year and are interested in learning more through a team training or individual workshops or courses, visit storytellingwithdata.com. There you'll also find a ton of related resources, our blog, podcast, online community, and more. And with that, I'm going to turn my attention to your questions. Let's see what we have here. Which tools is she using for the visuals? Everything you saw today, and actually all of the examples from all of our books, were made in Excel or PowerPoint or a combination of those 2 things. Find ourselves using Excel and PowerPoint almost all of the time, mainly because they're so pervasive. So many of our clients are using them. And I love that anybody can grab Excel and make a graph. It's both a fantastic and sometimes frightening thing, but the tool really isn't the important part. The lessons that we've talked about today, you'll notice I didn't mention tools other than pen and paper and Post-it notes for any of that. Really being thoughtful about what you need to communicate, and then using the tools you have at your disposal and using them thoughtfully. The best way to get to know any tool is to just force yourself to use it and ask smart questions of the people around you or online to be able to get support. When will the Kindle version of the updated book be released? I don't read paper books. So Before and After, which came out in September, is available on Kindle and e-readers. That's a great question, though, on the hardback. I don't have a good answer for that. So I will look into that one and follow up and see whether and when an electronic version of the 10-year edition will be coming. Let's see, when does the Storytelling with Data box set come out? Can't wait for the books. I love that somebody already knows that there's a box set coming. I think it got, the publisher got excited about the idea, and it's already maybe up on Amazon and elsewhere, but without any images or anything, because we actually haven't designed that yet. But I do have an email in my inbox from the publisher, and they're hoping for final artwork by the middle of December, which as we're recording this, it's December 2nd. So that's probably not likely to happen. But I think the current timeline has it coming out in March of 2026. It's possible it may be a month or 2 later than that, just depending on how things go. Are pie charts still evil? I love this question because actually I did a version of this presentation live in Zurich a couple of weeks ago. And one of the questions posed to me afterwards was, all right, you've given us these 10 lessons that have stood the test of time. What hasn't stood the test of time? And I hadn't really thought about it in advance. And so I gave some reasonably assembled answer. But actually, Mike on the team, who you've probably seen in chat today, because I know he was there providing some URLs, reminded me of something that has changed, which is my view on pie charts. And I think back when Storytelling with Data was originally published, it may have had words like pie charts are evil or put them under things to be avoided with some pretty strong language. I will say I don't love pie charts still. You saw how they made their appearance here, which was to be made over into a bar chart. But I have softened my view, and that is due to new research that came out in the interim. Robert Kosara and Drew Scow did some interesting tests and have a number of papers that came out, I don't know, probably 5-ish years ago now, actually debunking some of the ways that we thought pie charts were read. Turns out they're still not great for showing more than just a few slices, but when part to whole relationship is the main thing you want to show and you have a small number of slices, they can actually work reasonably well for that. How have you been using AI in your workflows now? Oh man, we didn't get to the hour before getting a question on AI. So I personally use AI mainly as a thought partner or sometimes for some light editing help. It can be great at giving you ideas you haven't thought of, or like playing a gnarly audience member. If you can give it a persona, it can be helpful for some of those types of interactions. The only time I've used it to visualize data so far that I actually did anything with was when I was needing to put together a really convoluted bad example and wanted it to not be good. It did a fantastic job. That was ChatGPT that time of that. I would say AI, you should absolutely be assessing it and understanding where you can use it to be efficient in the way that you work. Be careful about using it to analyze data. And I know this will advance quickly, but ask smart questions. Don't rely on it as the correct answer when it spits something out. And yeah, use your brain. Be thoughtful. Just scanning questions here. I think we're just about out of time, and I know that we haven't gotten to all the questions, but what I would love to invite, and we have a list going that maybe we'll seed in the comments for this video after we close down the live event so that we can answer those there. I'll also say if you have a question that you didn't get answered here, whether tuning in live or after the fact, please put that in a comment. We do read all of those, and I'll make sure that we spend some time going through and answering all of the questions and responding to all of the remarks that come up there. With that, though, I want to say thank you for celebrating the past decade of data storytelling with me. And don't forget to pick up your copy of the brand new Storytelling with Data 10-year anniversary edition, or the other books in the library and all that good stuff. And with that, just a reminder that the next time you need to communicate with data, consider how you'll use the lessons I've shared here today. Don't just make a graph. Weave the data you want to communicate into a story that builds understanding and drives action. See you next time.